welcome everyone. Nice to have you here and very happy to introduce Raza. Raza is a wildlife biologist, historian, author, and is working currently on a book on the tigers of Palamau. So he is going to tell us a little bit about how historical research is important to conservation and wildlife science. Raza.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for this kind invitation and for coming all the way to attend this talk. I had a pretty rough flight, pretty rough night. So I thought ki I'll now speak on the floor. It had been quite a disaster coming here. So I'm hoping that this talk doesn't turn out to be one. But I think when it comes to research, be it any form of research, whether it is wildlife research, whether it is historical research, I think the idea behind research is this sense of curiosity, and I think that is the sense of curiosity that drives all sorts of research, and historical research is something that I have been very curious about, and that has helped me understand the past of our natural history and conservation, and give new perspective and insights that I think otherwise might be difficult to get. So this is, by the way, a very nice illustration from a book called not surprisingly, Tiger Shooting, by William Rice, published in 1857. I mean, I'll just get into it, and speaking from the perspective of wildlife science first. So one of the very important aspects of when researchers are looking into understanding the natural history of various species is to understand their distribution and their habitat, and that is where historical research is of critical importance. And you can, I mean, if you're diligent enough and if you read into enough sources, not only are you likely to get a very broad picture of what was the historic distribution of a particular species, what was the kind of habitat it was living in those areas, and it could be many areas where what we today associate as the ideal habitats of a certain species, historically they might have, I mean, had more habitats than those that we currently know of. A very good example of this is maybe the cheetah, which is all over the news. So historically, as in now, the general perception has been that cheetah is a savanna specialist and a open grassland specialist. But if you look at the natural history of the species in India and go back into the colonial period and the Mughal period, the records from there onward, you'll find that they were found in habitats which were what you'd call in many areas open forests, so to speak. The cheetah trappers used to give detailed accounts of how the cheetahs which operated in these areas were more of ambush hunters rather than sprinting after the prey. So such insights, I mean, for example, this is one research that I had done back in the day, was looking into the distribution of lions in Haryana around Delhi. And these locations that you see are all the places where lions were shot or sighted in colonial period between say 1800 to 1814, 1820, 1822. And in that period, if you go into the record, you'll find that about this is a period where record keeping was just beginning to take root, and they shot around 130 or something lions in that landscape within 20 years. Pride after pride were eradicated, and that is how eventually the lions went extinct from Haryana. Eventually, then they were wiped out from central India. Then Gujarat, they were wiped out from Rajkot and rest of Saurashtra till they were left only in Gir. Similarly, I mean, this is from there was a famous expedition that happened in 1930 by a famous naturalist called Arthur Verne. He came to India to survey Gir, perhaps one of the earliest studies on Gir. So he had taken the landscape photographs of Gir, written about the the floral makeup of that landscape, the faunal makeup, obviously. So these data points are very important if you were to say understand oh, what is the current floral makeup of Gir and what was the historic floral makeup? How has it impacted the various faunal species? What has caused those changes, and so on and so forth. This is similarly, I mean, this is again from Gujarat. So this lion that is running off from a cattle kill. You can notice that the British artists were very careful about being very accurate with their habitat, as in they were very careful to be as true to what they saw in the wild when they were representing it in their lithographs. Most of the time, might be exceptions. Similarly, that's an image of the Hangul. These are images from Himachal Pradesh. So now we don't have Hangul in Himachal Pradesh. As you would know, Dachigam is the only habitat for Hangul in India. But back in the day, it was well distributed into the Himalayas in Himachal, apart from in Kashmir. This is, I think, if I remember correctly, from Chamba somewhere. Incidentally, worth pointing out that these things have also died out. A lot of old names for animals that used to be used. So, for example, Hangul was also known as Barasingh, different from Barasingha, that is the swamp deer. It was known as the Barasingh. This is another, so how history helps you understand the species distribution and interesting interactions. This is a painting by Sir Charles Doyley, and this, if you would notice carefully, you can see three animals dead that have been shot in a single shoot: a tiger, a lion, and probably a nilgai, female nilgai. So this is very interesting because during the course of my research, I actually found records of lions and tigers cohabiting same landscape. In fact, same patches of forest, you could say, in around Delhi and Haryana. And this was one of those such hunts which either Doyley witnessed or he was told about, and he drew what he saw. The one of the literary account that I have is that a lion was shot and a tiger was shot from the same patch of forest in about after with a 6-hour gap in between the two. So this is again a very good example of the habitat and species distribution in arid habitat. So you can see a little, not so little bustard there, and plenty of black bucks, and you can see, there are some people on camelback. Those usually in these areas, hunting was done on camelback by the British hunters. So you can see that. And I'm not sure what, maybe there's some sort of cranes or whatever. I'm not very sure. But to give you a perspective of what distribution and habitat of these animals was. So, for example, you would find colonial records of Haryana where they would say that, and the author writes that people will not believe me when I say this, and they think that I'm bluffing. But I have seen in a single grassland, I have seen herds of 10 to 12,000 black bucks, and I've made an ocular count. And 2,000 to 3,000 herds were very common. They would shoot off 50, 60, 70 great Indian bustards in a single day. They used to see 100, 120 bustards in a single day in Haryana. Now you can't think of having such distribution. So it is important to recognize how how rich India's faunal makeup was, and also how wide the distribution was compared to today. What we have today is a fraction of what we had maybe 200, 250 years ago, maybe even as late as 100 years ago. Another arid species, the caracal, which is considered, one of perhaps the rarest cat in India. And these two are interesting images because these are perhaps represent some of the extreme ranges of caracals where photographic evidence was obtained. That caracal kitten that you see there was obtained in Mirzapur, which is in eastern Uttar Pradesh. There, a bunch of forest laborers were working in a forest department plantation, and they came across kittens with the mother. And so the mother ran off, and they were left with the kitten. And the DFO then took, or I think the range officer took these photos and sent it to this old journal, which was published from Dehradun. This was in the early 70s. And then these kittens were packed off to the Kanpur Zoo. This is another photographic record, perhaps the only photographic record of a caracal in Madhya Pradesh. So that is the only photographic record from Uttar Pradesh. That is the only photographic record from Madhya Pradesh. This was, caracal cub was caught in Shivpuri, which is in northwestern Madhya Pradesh, very close to Kuno. It is in the news now when one of those cheetahs had marched into Shivpuri. Similarly, another species that I'm quite fascinated by, and which is not much talked about, is the central Indian wild buffalo. I mean, people know about the wild buffalo in Assam and but the central Indian wild buffalo is usually considered the more purer form of wild buffalo, because it's said that the northeastern wild populations have had some intermingling with the domestic buffaloes, but the central Indian ones did not have. And these are, so this was the habitat in the Sal forest. I mean, so these illustrations give you a very good idea of what the habitat was. These are most probably from Bastar, these photographs. So you can see that they would move by in the Sal forest during the day, and then these pools that they used to wallow in and come down to drink, these were called sarars in Chhattisgarh. This was the ideal habitat. We still have some handful of wild buffaloes left in Kolamarka in Maharashtra, which is on the Indravati, as in on the Bastar and Gadchiroli border. But you can imagine how wide the distribution was by this map. So you can see that we maybe now have one population, single population left here, and it has been wiped off all across. But back in the day, this was all across. In fact, this is from an old book by a well-known naturalist of his time called Balakrishnan Seshadri. He published a book called Twilight of India's Wildlife, one of the earliest books on wildlife of India written by an Indian, and one of the most comprehensive even today. So these all populations were lost. In fact, if you read the accounts of some of the famous books by, say, Highlands of Central India by Forsyth and so on and so forth, he would say that in around Raipur, that is now the capital of Chhattisgarh, he would come across herds of 80 to 100 wild buffaloes in a single area. Now perhaps the entire population of the central Indian wild buffalo is about maybe 50 at the most. So this is a wild buffalo from Orissa. So the distribution was well into Orissa. In fact, back in the day, if you went through the old forest department pamphlets that they used to take out, they would advertise Orissa not as the land of, say, now black tigers that Uma ma'am is researching over, but they advertise themselves as the land of the wild buffalo. And unfortunately, within 30 years, they lost them. And then you also can look into the causes. If you look into the distribution, and then you observe what were the other things that were happening. So then these dams were coming up around the same time. The Bali Mela Reservoir, the Malkangiri, that is Koraput. There were a series of dams that were built there, 5 huge dams. They basically completely wiped out the wild buffaloes from those areas. Similar things happened in central in Chhattisgarh and in central Odisha. So I mean, coming to one of the favorite, species of the day. This is perhaps the oldest known photograph of the cheetah Asiatic cheetah in India. Obviously, these are not. I mean, the photographer has tried to capture them in a way that they look that they've been caught in, they've been snapped in the wild. But they didn't have the kind of technology then to take such close-up photos of cheetah in the wild. So they're mostly probably coursing cheetah that were caught by the princely states, and they took them in this. This was taken somewhere in the Deccan, and this was the distribution of cheetah. So what I was telling you about, that interesting insights that come about not just the distribution of the species but also the habitat, is because if you notice that a lot of the distribution is around these open forests on the Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra border. Here in these open forests, Sal forests of Jharkhand, Odisha, northwestern, so Vindhyachal, Kaimur, all these areas. So basically, you'll find that they were as down far as Tirunelveli. And if you look at the prey of the cheetah, while the major prey was obviously the black buck as is commonly associated, but there were other prey. They used to prey heavily on the chinkara. They used to prey heavily on the they used to prey on sheep and all as well, goats and sheep, which sometimes brought them into conflict with people. They used to hunt down cheetal where they got an opportunity. There are records of them hunting down nilgais. So usually a coalition of 2 or 3 cheetahs would bring down a nilgai. There are records of them hunting down sambar, which is usually associated as a forest deer. So these are some of the. I mean, I've talked enough about the mammals. This is about the gharial. So I've been recently working on the history of gharial in East Central India, and all these places that you see marked out, these are places where gharials have been recorded in the past in these states of Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Jharkhand, Godavari, as in Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, and even on the Telangana Maharashtra border. Um, we don't have gharials anymore. And again, if you look at the history, you know what the causes were. You will also notice that almost everywhere. So uh, oh, um, these black dots that you see here, these are the barrages, the dams that were built. As soon as dams and barrages started being built, it completely changed the ecology of these rivers, and gharials died out. Obviously, that was accompanied by hunting as well, because remember when dams were built, especially in those era when when in those times when there wasn't any um, as in there wasn't centralized legal framework to stop hunting. Um, Gharials were bummed off by anybody and everybody, especially by people, laborers who would come to build these dams. So you would have maybe thousands of people coming into those areas, riverbeds. They would take out the eggs. They would, uh, you know, um, kill off the gharials. And obviously, then the river ecology changed as well because of all these dams. So you can see how many dams have been, or barrages, or dams have been built on all these rivers. And now gharials, as some of you might know, are only found in maybe 5 or 7 of them are found in Satkosia Tiger Reserve, the stretch of Mahanadi, a small gorge area. Everywhere else, they have been rendered extinct. In fact, it is very interesting because uh, extinction is not just or the disappearance of species is not just the disappearance of species itself, as in that is one. It is also disappearance of human cultures associated with it. I was reading up on stuff, and you find fascinating folklore and stories among the local Adivasis that used to revolve around these species. And once the species died out, slowly and surely those cultures and those stories and those folklores died out as well. So in a way, it's a cultural loss as well, and not just environmental loss, so to speak. Um, and so obviously now moving on to, we've looked at the distribution and the habitat. One of the other things that I wanted to point out was that maybe I'll cover this in the causes of the decline. So one is very obvious that all of us know about, that hunting, rampant hunting, was the order of the day, especially during the colonial rule. This is a very good example of how an average colonial hunt used to go by. These men that you see who are actually doing the tracking and pointing out the tiger to the Gora Sahibs, as we would these guys would call them. They are the trackers or the beaters, as they used to be called, mostly shikaris, or they were given the term shikari. In fact, this lexicon of calling shikaris poachers, this poachers being called shikaris, or shikari getting that negative connotation of not being sportsmen, comes from this period, because the British man or the white man was the sportsman who was doing the ethical hunting, and these trackers were the shikaris who just killed off and had no ethics, quote unquote. So this was your average, and this is an average, how an average tiger shoot would go. And I mean, these are all from that same book, very unimaginatively named Tiger Shooting. So, um, uh, and so, but that was one. These photographs are important because these tell you the disappearances that have happened in a more recent past. These are photos of tigers from Nagaland. So back in the, I mean, and this is why I also suggest that while you're reading your doing your historical reading, you should also try to inculcate an interest in also reading about the communities and their anthropology, as you would call it, or just learning about their culture, histories. So you would know that Nagas, tigers have a very important place in the Naga pantheon, especially the as in the pre-Christianity phase of Nagaland. And every within the Nagas, you had the Ao Nagas, the Angami Nagas, and many more. So all of them had separate belief systems relating to tigers. And tiger hunting was sort of a rite of passage for men of those times. And this continued way into the 60s. So these images were taken in the 60s, and the author, the left image is from Balakrishna Seshadri, and the right is from, I think it's from Hornbill, if I remember, one of the early issues of Hornbill. These he writes that he saw such sights in almost every other village. During the post-monsoon seasons, tigers would be killed, and then they would be put up in these stilts, where they would be sort of paraded around as, the to prove the prowess of the community or the men of that village. And village after village, such sites were common. And then obviously the inevitable happened that tigers went extinct from Nagaland. So similarly, these are two interesting images. Now this image that you see is of a lion being hunted, but this lion is not being hunted where you would usually associate in Gujarat. This lion is being killed in Haryana. This is from a sketchbook, a book called by Captain Mandi, which was published in 1832, and he was hunting lions in Haryana at that point of time in the early 1800s. And this was one of the incidents. In fact, they recount that unlike the current sort of image of lions of Gir being rather friendly to humans and docile and so on and so forth, he writes that in Haryana, the lions were pretty ferocious. In fact, all the hunters, hunter after hunter, writes that the lions were much more ferocious than tigers. And, they used to consider the tiger to be a bigger quote unquote foe compared to the lion. Similarly, this other image is of a Gujarat tiger. So there's a Haryana lion, and from the land of the lion is the land of the tiger. It's a tiger from the land of the lion. So Gujarat used to have quite a good tiger population right up till the maybe early 1950s, and then they started declining, and the last tiger was killed off in Waghai in 1983, which is in South Gujarat, Dang's forest. But back in the day, they were distributed all over northern Gujarat, southern Gujarat, and eastern Gujarat along the Madhya Pradesh border. And even if you turn the clock back to maybe 100 years back, maybe in the early 1800s, you actually had lions and tigers cohabiting the same landscapes in Gujarat as well, just as was the case in Haryana and central India. This is a very interesting depiction of it depicts what was being hunted, the kind of habitat, what were the methods that were being employed, what were the species that were being hunted. So you can see, there are wild boars, there are foxes, what seem like foxes, there are I'm not sure, some sort of pups or something. There are sand grouse or maybe some sort of birds. Maybe one of the I think complaints everybody will have is that I don't talk about birds in this presentation. That's because I'm very poor with birds. So I'll leave that the natural history of birds up to experts of that domain. So that was one. Similarly, this a threat that we are all too familiar with today: railway lines. The first railway lines were coming into India, and railway lines coming into India was not just about you know collisions that were happening with wildlife. There was a complete deliberate attempt to cleanse off any wildlife from areas where railway lines were being laid, because they didn't want mishaps, but also, and the other was that railways opened new hunting grounds for the British. So areas which were previously inaccessible by road or by foot, they were opened up by the railways. There are plenty of accounts of gung ho hunters shooting off randomly animals from the train. And obviously, accidents like this that we are all too familiar with, they are. This is about maybe a 150-year-old sketch or something, and you can see there's a elephant herd in the background, and this one male herd, male tusker or male makana, whatever, is charging the engine, and he died eventually. Uh, Same with tiger, same with black buck. So all sorts of species that we associate with linear infrastructure losses today. There's a history to it if you go back in time. So that was one. The other that I wanted to talk about was that we have looked into these issues. The other is that if you look into other uh, it is equally important to remember that it was not just hunting and shikar that did India's wildlife in. There were other two major factors that my at least research, based on my research, this is my hypothesis. One was that something that is not really looked into by people working in the wildlife sciences is the history of silviculture in India. India's forests, as you see them today, very few of them, especially in the mainland India, are actually what the original makeup of the forest was. All these forests, be it your Kana, be it your Corbett, be it your South Indian forest, be it your East Central Indian forest, all of them were very heavily what were the British used to call quote unquote worked, which was basically changing the composition of the forest so as to maximize timber growing species and eliminating all other useless quote unquote species. So what happened was that they changed the entire ecological makeup of the forest. And obviously, once you change the entire ecological makeup of the forest, all the associated species are affected. And so a huge reason for the decline of wildlife in India in many areas was because a lot of mixed forests were converted into monocultures of sal. So, I mean, a very good example is some of you might have heard the name of Saranda, which is in Singhbhum. It is often in the news as the quote unquote Asia's largest sal forest. But unfortunately, in most parts of Saranda, it is a monoculture of sal. The Britishers had completely changed the makeup of that forest, and that is why you notice that as silvicultural working in that area picks up steam, um, you will notice that the wildlife starts declining. And eventually, by the 70s, you had huge, beautiful, thick stands of sal, but it was a barren desert by then. Obviously, hunting played its part. Local communities also hunted a lot. Bushmeat hunting was a huge problem, but also the ecological makeup of the land was changed. This is something that happens even today. If you look into what is happening in places like say Corbett, we look at Corbett and we say, oh, the tigers are doing well, so Corbett is everything is good there. But if you remember, if you read into history, you'll find that Corbett was one of the most important hog deer habitats in northern India. But unfortunately, what happened was because the management was primed towards making it more suitable for tigers, so the grassland burning was done in a particular way. Water holes were created. The hydrology of the area was changed. Obviously, the Kalagarh Dam came up. All that led to the hog deer are nearly extinct in Corbett. Similarly, Gore went extinct in Bandhavgarh despite it being doing very well otherwise. Black buck went extinct in Kanha. These all are because interventions were done which actually changed the ecological makeup of that forest, and that impacted certain species. That is one. The other is that we have talked about hunting, but hunting was one aspect of it. There was something that the British, as part of their agrarian expansion, they were very keen on destroying all wildlife that they thought was harmful to the farmer or to agrarian expansion. So a proper policy called policy for destruction of dangerous beasts and vermin was launched, and snakes as well. So snakes were also bumped off in the thousands, especially between 1875 to 1925. And in that period, the oft quoted figure that Professor Mahesh Rangarajan has researched into, 25,000 tigers, 80,000 leopards, 2 lakh wolves, and so on and so forth were killed off. And snakes maybe in the millions. So that was one. This policy, it is often thought that this policy ended with the British, but in many ways this policy was actually continued even post independence. So if you read into history, you will again find out that between the biggest massacre of wildlife that happened perhaps after 1925 would be post independence between 1947 to say somewhere around 1967, those crucial 20 years. One was that there was something called shikar companies that came up, perhaps the precursors to our big tourism companies. They used to bring foreign clients and they used to camp in the forest, shoot a tiger, shoot other animals, so on and so forth. But other than that, there was a so you would remember that during the British period, arms were not allowed. Indians were not allowed to bear arms due to the Arms Act, and so farmers used to bear a lot of losses, and that was their grouse, that we bear a lot of losses. And when due to crop raiding by animals, and when India became independent and India was facing a food crisis, so to increase food production, gun licenses were granted absolutely randomly to anyone and everyone who was applying for it, and there was no check on what he was doing with that gun license. So then people were shooting everything and anything in their sight. So, and there were no legislation as such that could stop that, or even if there were, some states had some game laws, what they used to call them, but they were not good enough to, or they didn't have enough teeth or enforcement to be actually make any difference. So that was another factor that did most of India's wildlife in that crucial period of 47 to 67. You can imagine that in those days, I mean, we don't even have figures for what the herbivore loss was through such hunting, but every year India was exporting anywhere between 500 to 1,000 tiger skins for that entire duration every year. Um, so that is one. So that was one aspect of understanding species distribution, habitat, how we got here, and so on and so forth. But wildlife history is also very interesting from, if you're just purely from a natural historian's point of view. This is a very interesting painting because this is perhaps the only depiction of dholes, wild dogs, killing off a tiger. There are some certain incidences of them being such events happening that are recorded in the old issues of Journal of Bombay Naturalistic Society, but this is perhaps the only visual representation of it. And I mean, I am a slightly movie buff as well, so if you have, any of you have watched Zanjeer, you will remember that Sher Khan, the character of Pran, in it also says that when Amitabh is going to fight off all the criminals on his own, insisting on fighting off criminals on his own, so he says कि एक शेर को जो है वो एक अकेले शेर को भी जंगली कुत्ते जो है वो मिलके मार सकते हैं. So it was a very astute naturalistic observation. Similarly, you can see that the fact that leopards used to prey on camels very regularly in Haryana and Gujarat. So camels were one of the primary prey species of both lions and leopards in these arid landscapes. Things that we don't associate with. Those are some interesting, photographs of bustard eggs and so on and so forth, and other things that I found interesting. Then the kind of research that Dr. Ramakrishnan is doing. So looking into the aberrations in species. White tigers, we often associate them with Riva, but Riva was perhaps the last in a very long story of white tigers that went right from the colonial period. The earliest record of a white tiger comes from Akbar's court, where in Gwalior, near Gwalior, he shot, as in he killed a tigress with, I think, 4 cubs or something. 3 of them were normal, 1 was white, and that trend continued. Corbett, if you remember, videographed a white tigress in Kumaon. This white tiger, was shot in the forest around Hazaribagh in Jharkhand. This that you see, the Gidhor tiger that is being talked about in this newspaper clipping, that was shot. Gidhor is just north of Hazaribagh. So this entire landscape used to produce 1 to 2 white tigers every year to the gun. There are probably more in the forest, but at least 1 to 2 were brought to the gun every year for at least 3 to 4 decades. Similarly, this melanistic leopard that you see here, this was also shot in Hazaribagh. Interestingly, Hazaribagh has a unique distinction where it is the only perhaps place in the world where a white tiger has been shot, a melanistic leopard has been shot, and perhaps the rarest of all aberrations, that is a white or at least a semi-white leopard was shot. Um, and that was also presented to the British Museum. So you can make out what was the history of these genetic variations, or these aberrations, as you would call it, and what was the distribution. So now we know, maybe for example, black tiger, or so-called black tiger, the melanistic tigers, are limited to Simlipal or are found in Simlipal. I have not been able to actually trace if they were there in history as well. Because princely states, unfortunately, especially those in East Central India, they have very poor record keeping, and the British did not bother to write about them. I remember reading about a completely black tiger being shot in Chittagong Hills, for example. That is on the Bangladesh and Assam border. Then you have, white tigers were shot in Orissa, they were shot in Bihar, so all over the place, as I told you about Hazaribagh and Gidhor and all these areas. They were shot even as far as in Bilaspur, which is now in Chhattisgarh, in Madhya Pradesh, and obviously, as Corbett had photographed them, in Kumaon. Similarly, a Central Indian wild buffalo turning in Panna, of all the places. It's a mystery that has never been solved. How did a wild buffalo reach from its only known habitat at that point of time? This was in the early 70s, which was the forest around Udanti Sita Nadi, Garyaban, which is now the Udanti Sita Nadi Tiger Reserve, or Bastar, and marched all the way into the dry forest of Panna in Chhatarpur. That is the white tigress by Corbett. Then, I couldn't get the full photograph, but that was another interesting specimen that I came across, a hybrid of a Sambar and a Barasingha that was shot in Balaghat. So these are sort of the interesting natural history observation that also you come across. This maybe is perhaps another interesting story. I had written about it. This lion is not an Indian lion, it's an African lion in India. This is one of the African lions that were introduced by the Maharaja of Gwalior in what is now Kuno. So before, cheetahs are not the first African cat to come to Kuno. It was the African lion that came to Kuno first. That in fact, that was the world's first transcontinental relocation or introduction, whatever you'd like to call it. And those tigers, those lions, then proving that much before AJT John Singh Saab or Ravi Chelan Saab did their studies in Kuno on the feasibility of Kuno being a second home of lion, the fact that African lions had not just been introduced but actually bred in that same landscape proved and survived for almost 17, 18 years. Oh no, in fact, 23 years. The first batch was released in 1908, and I think the last was shot around 1937, though LS sighting continues up till the late 1950s. So the fact that these lions survived, they bred, prides were sighted, and it proves that Kuno was at least what the ecological makeup of Kuno was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, was conducive enough for lions to thrive. So these are the kind of things that you find from the past, obviously, and then these lions did exactly what the cheetahs of Kuno are doing today. They started migrating out of Kuno. Some went to almost the same, it is very uncanny, but they took the same route that the cheetahs are taking today. Some went off to Shivpuri, some went off to Itawa. You can see the lions were being bagged in Jhansi, and you remember reading cheetahs, every one of them went towards Jhansi. And eventually this was shot in Panna. The gentleman standing here with the lion is the Maharaja of Panna. This is the kind of interesting stuff that you come across. This huge tiger, perhaps the largest tiger that I have ever known, was shot in the forest of Hazaribagh in Jharkhand. Hazaribagh doesn't have tigers anymore. These tigers are extinct. But this is what it was back in the day, and you can also imagine the not just the loss of the tiger from that area, the kind of gene pool that was lost with such specimens being bumped off. So those are interesting. This is just, I'm broadly telling you there are so many other things about birds, reptilia, mammalia, amphibians. The good thing about the Britishers was, despite all the things, nasty things that they did, was that they were very meticulous with their record keeping, and they wrote a lot. Even they could, I mean, they were quirky enough that they could write monograph after monograph on a fly and what it was doing in the forest. So that was the level of detail, and then they could obviously go to the tiger. So if you are interested in flies, if you are interested in butterflies, fishes, snakes, anything and everything, if you look well enough, you'll find plenty of stuff in the pages of Time related to your species of choice. Um, then the early wildlife, I mean, if you look into history, and now we are coming more from the wildlife science and natural history perspective onto the conservation perspective, wildlife management became started taking root. This was started basically, many other things, among other things that were done were, the first census was taken up. There was an officer by the name of J.W. Nicholson. He was in Palamu, which is incidentally the place that I have grown up in. And he, in 1934, carried out the first census and gives very interesting detail of how he did it, so on and so forth. And that the other thing, that the other page that you see, that is, the census was just like today. After 4 years, they decided back then to reconduct the census after 4 years, and this was a different DFO. So Nicholson did it in 34. Those are the figures given by CM Chaudhary in 1938, and he gives, you look, they conducted it using the same Pugmark census technique that was later refined by SR Chaudhary. And they have male, females, all that, what was the total population, so on and so forth. And speaking of census, how many tigers are there? That is a letter by Corbett himself. I mean, if, perhaps it's not very clear, but that is signed by Jim Corbett, and he has written this. I found this letter at a second-hand bookshop, so I was lucky. Here he writes that, if you can see. See, he writes, I'm glad I got, he's talking about filming his tigers, that the film that I talked about, where he also filmed that white tiger. I'm glad I got that film when I did, for in a few years, 10 at most, he's writing in 47, 10 at most, tigers will be extinct, except possibly in a few isolated pockets in Indian state, that is Princely state, because Princely state used to take great pride in protecting their wildlife for their hunting. So this was his prediction. Obviously, it was belied, but it's interesting to see his perspective. J. Julian Spilett was a very was a pioneering scientist who worked in India just before and also during Josh Haller's time, and he started also uh, writing about wildlife management from an Indian perspective, and also interacting with Indian Forest Department officers, and exchanging ideas and so on and so forth. And that is perhaps the most important article that was published, at least from the whole tiger number thing. This is the paper by Saroj Raj Chaudhary, Let Us Count Our Tigers, published in 1970, that laid the foundations of wildlife census in tiger census in India, a process that would continue up to 2006, when it was finally scrapped and camera traps were replaced them. Even then, the Pugmark census is, at least the Pugmark technique, is still used to identify tigers, to identify areas where the camera traps should be laid and there's a higher probability of getting trapped. So it still has its relevance. And then about conservation, and that is the interesting story. This is a very interesting story because I think all of us know about Corbett the hunter, but very few of us know about Corbett the conservationist and other people who time has forgotten. This, perhaps the first ever conservation organization in India, what you would call conservation in the modern sense of conservation, was something called the Association for Preservation of Game in UP. UP as in United Provinces back in the day. It was started by Jim Corbett in 1932. Jim Corbett, R.C. Morris, who was here, in fact, he lived in close to BRT Hills, and he died here. His family gravestones are still here. I've seen some photos. So R.C. Morris and another very interesting gentleman by the name of Hassan Abid Jafri. He was the secretary to the princely state, or not the princely state, but the huge zamindari of Mahmudabad in Uttar Pradesh. And these three started the Indian Wildlife Magazine, the first wildlife magazine, so to speak, in 1936, and also started working, appealing for conservation of wildlife, saying the animals are now going extinct and it's time to put the gun aside and take up the cause of conservation, do photography, and so on and so forth. But I think the biggest crowning achievement of this group was this: the first All India Conference on the Preservation of Wildlife, uh, something perhaps that has never been repeated since in India. And this was in 1935, when, and it was remarkable because this conference was not just attended by all the British provinces, but it was attended by every single princely state of India. The princely states that were very small, they would pool together, 5-7 princely states would choose their representative and send them to the conference. And some of the debates, if you go through the proceedings, you will find them that maybe this is 2022 and not 1935. And all the heavyweights of conservation, or the names that you can think of: F.W. Champion, Corbett, Dunbar Brander, J.W. Nicholson, F. Canning, Wimbush from South India, Nawab of Bhopal, everybody was there. And they were discussing stuff like caracals are getting rare, we need to preserve the caracals. Somebody was saying that the cheetahs are going rare. Somebody was saying that we can't, certain species cannot be, they are, say, the debate that we have: monkeys are causing crop damage, they need to be declared vermin. Boars are causing a lot of damage, they need to be declared vermin, so on and so forth. The fact that in some areas, the kind of thing that we think we now understand, the discussions were around that, okay, let us protect certain species in certain areas where they are getting rare, but in certain areas where they are getting, out of hand, there we need to put some measures to get their population under check, and so on and so forth. This was the magazine that they started. And wildlife preservation efforts had started in various states by the 1940s. I think perhaps the pioneer in all this was Assam, which started preserving its rhinos in Kaziranga, and Gujarat with his Nawab of Junagadh. But by the 1940s onwards, that ethic of conservation that was started by this conference. Oh, and a very important outcome of this conservation: India's first national park, Haley National Park, which we now know as Corbett. So Corbett was born out of this, and so was Nanda Devi. So because this conference was held in United Provinces, and then the Viceroy of United Provinces, Haley, was a good friend of Corbett, and he pulled some string. Hassan Jafri Saab pulled some string, and then they were like, let us pass that law, the United Provinces National Parks Act. And under that act, 2 national parks were created: Corbett, as in Haley back then, and then Nanda Devi. Then again, looking at how comparing the decline. So this is a map from the 1972 Project Tiger report, and it gives the figures of rough figures of tigers in each of those states. Obviously, one can argue that the figures today are not comparable with those figures because the methodology has changed, but you can get a general idea by using these figures. Then every year, Forest Department used to publish something called the Forest Administration Report. There they would give how many tigers were shot legally in each state. Then they, so that using those numbers, you can get an idea that these numbers are pretty much accurate. In fact, if I could give my opinion, I would say that the 1972 count was a undercount. We definitely had more tigers than what was reported in 1972, because a lot of areas were not counted. Mizoram was not counted. Nagaland, nobody went to. They went few forests in Sundarbans was excluded, and so on and so forth. And you can see that there is a sharp decline. If you are to draw an imaginary line from here, from this, so you find, and then go this way, and go this way, and so you will find that all the East Central Indian states, tigers have gone nearly extinct there. And this is the 2018 census. The numbers are even more dismal this time around, except for 2 bright spots: Simlipal and Nagarjuna Sri Salem, or and Amrabad, that is the Nalamala Hills. So these, if you know these things, then you can put it in perspective that all the celebration that we are doing, I mean, yes, we have increased tigers in western half, but we have almost lost all tigers in one half of the country. So is it really a success? Project Tiger, has it really has been successful in what it aimed to do 50 years ago? Maybe it's been a success if you look at, starting 2006 onward, when the numbers had dropped to 1400. So question like that. This is a map of the occupancy. You can clearly know. So this is the occupancy map drawn by Kailash Sankla in 72, and he traveled extensively across the length and breadth of India. And look at the occupancy map in 2000. This is the latest 2022 map. You can see all the spots are gone from East Central India and Northeast India. And then we also can, history gives us a perspective on how we reached here in terms of our laws, policies. Why do we have certain laws? Perhaps the first major act was the Indian Forest Act of 1878. We know about it in 1927, but this was the original act in 1878. How forests were managed then. Perhaps the first species-specific act, and perhaps the only species-specific act in India's history, the Elephant Preservation Act, passed in 1879. In fact, that's interesting because in 1879, another interesting organization and came up in this area called the Nilgiri Wildlife Preservation Society, and that came up almost in conjunction with this, and the idea was to protect game in what they call game in the Nilgiris, and including fishes. So the law, the society was created out of an act, and there was a huge push to protect the freshwater fishes, especially the Kaveri Mahasir, which is now going extinct. So that is that, and that is perhaps the first all India law that came up, the Indian Wild Birds and Animals Protection Act of 1912. All these acts were obviously not, they were of no match what they are today, but they created certain first steps towards conservation. They started close season, the concept of close season, that certain animals cannot be shot in certain seasons. Shooting blocks, the concept of shooting blocks was brought about. And it is interesting that if you go back in the past, almost all your sanctuaries and national parks today were shooting blocks of the British period. So, be it South India, North India, East India, Central India, everywhere this is the same trend. Shooting blocks became the core of all our protected areas today. And this is then obviously the history of the forest department itself. That this is a photo taken by F.W. Champion of 2 forest guards in Lansdowne division. You can see the elephant grass in that area, and I mean, they're coming after some work probably. And so the forest department came up in the 1860s, and it has its own history, and I can't go into that. But a good way to take note or take stock of what was happening with India's forests and wildlife, but especially mostly forests, and what was the ecological makeup and changing the ecological makeup of India's forests that I was talking about. A very good source for that is to go through every province had its own administrative report that was produced every year. And if you go through them, and if you have the patience to go through them, you come across some stunning insights. And obviously that has all data stuff, such as how many tigers were shot in this state in this year, how many leopards were killed, how many elephants were captured, how many people were killed, and so on and so forth. And then when we talk about conservation and histories, it's also equally about you can't have conservation without taking people into account, and you can't make conservation decisions, or you can't take the best conservation decisions if you don't know the people of that landscape, if you don't know their histories, their culture, their faith. And that is again where history is a very important tool to understand their culture, where their worldview comes from, things that we as maybe conservationists might think that or are evidently empirically impact wildlife negatively. But then what is the genesis of those cultures, those systems, and how can you perhaps get the communities on board by first understanding their culture? I mean, only when you know that why certain things are being done, that you can then think of talking to them or discussing with them on how to maybe make certain changes in those traditions. So these are, hunting. Again, disclaimer that my sort of area of knowledge is mostly central and east central India. I can speak about the Adivasi communities of those areas. Every other part of our country has communities who are, who have historically lived in our forest, and they have similar, or in at least they follow the same pattern, one could say. They maybe not similar. um, so it is important to understand what the historical link of communities with forest was, and how their pantheon on faith system functions, um, and has developed over the years, and how it changes with change in forest and decline of wildlife, or changes in wildlife pattern. So, for example, this is so Baigas, which are the Adivasi community that Kanha and Dindori and Achanak, Chhattisgarh, they are the dominant community in those areas. This is their tribal god, who is named Baghesur. He's a tiger god who, I mean, if you do anything that is against the rules of the community, a tiger will devour you, but it is not actually a tiger that devours you, it's actually a Baghesur. If the tiger god, the god comes in and takes sort of uh, puts in the punishment. And it's very interesting. There, I mean, I've not written it here, but there's an interesting saying that the Vegas had back in the day. They used to say that death by tigers is actually painless, because the tiger god, when he comes and when he's about to kill you, he stupefies you and puts you in a trance before that, and then kills you, and so people don't resist, and it's painless. uh, Similarly, innocuous, what to us might look like an innocuous stone, is the representation of Thakur Dev, who's another high god of the Bhumiyas, who are a subclan of the Baigas. um, these are the earliest forest trackers of that I photographed, that I could find of, from the princely state of Bonai, which is in in North Odisha, and now in Sundargarh district. They did pretty much the same job. This is from 1890s, that our people, forest trackers, do. As in, when I say forest trackers, I mean the daily wage laborers who work for the forest department, who are almost always drawn from the local villages, and are usually from the local communities, forest dwelling communities. So it was interesting to read about their life and what they were doing 110 years ago, and so on and so forth. That is an interesting, uh, as I told you about, there's an interesting anthropology and story of the and history and culture of the shikaris who used to accompany these uh, bada sahibs to the hunts, and actually did everything except pulling the trigger. This is a ho. Hos are the Adivasis of southern Jharkhand, and this is, they were demonstrating how they snared tigers, and unfortunately, there are no more tigers in Singhbhum, so most of them were snared out eventually. But it is interesting that back in those days, tigers used to be the, so for example, when you go to law courts, uh, they'll ask you ki, if you're a Muslim, to Quran pe you say ya Gita ki qasam khata hu. For Hos, they would only swear on a tiger skin. So and again, as I said, that culture has also gone with the disappearance of wildlife from those areas. Similarly, this is Matti Uthana, which is basically a tradition among Gonds and Baigas, where if a tiger has killed, or used to be a tradition where if a tiger has killed a human being, there you need to do a certain ritual, uh, where this man would have the tiger spirit possess him, and then he would do certain rituals. And if you did not do that, the tiger would actually, the spirit of the man who the tiger devoured, it was said that he started riding the tiger, and he would start identifying victims, next victim, and killing people off. Similarly, this is a very interesting account of Baigas having identifying 13 different types of tigers or big cats or predators. So you have, the white tiger, they called it Sher Bagh. Elvin records this in 1939. Dhor Bagh, as in the cattle-eating tiger. Then you have Singh Bagh, perhaps the memory of the lion from central India. there is tiger, there is cheetah, there is tendua, there's son cheetah, which is probably cheetah. There is, there is hyena, there is small dog-like bug, which is probably Elvin meant either a wolf or a CR, as in a jackal. I'm not sure, but so on and so forth. So there is similarly, I think none of us would be able to do this, but the Begas have 21 different names for rodents. As in, they have 21 different rodents that they identify with different names, and they're quite interesting names. Similarly, the traditions of how hunting was done in those times, and so on and so forth, because it is interesting, because you have to understand them, because even from a very, forget anthropological perspective, but even from a very enforcement oriented perspective, it is important, because in most of these areas it is the same techniques that are being used, and the forest officers have no idea of how the bushmeat hunting is happening. They can't identify the traps, or the forest guards are fail to often identify the traps because they are so innocuous looking. But there is plenty of literature on identifying what different types of hunting traps are, and what animal they are laid for, and so on and so forth. And they also give vital information on the distribution, because they tell ki in this forest this community lives and it hunts this animal. You can compare it with today and see ki whether these animals are still there or not, and so on and so forth. uh, and then there are just, this is perhaps not related to the topic and of the talk, but there are just stories that you come across, interesting stories that you come across, and if you dig enough, maybe you come across the you can be privy to that entire story. This is perhaps the only memorial to a Adivasi tracker that was erected in what is now Achanakma Tiger Reserve. And eventually I was able to track down a Hindi mein written book by Khokhar Sahab, who shot that tiger, and the story of Meku and what happened to him, and so on and so forth. And someday maybe I'll write that story. That is a very interesting story. He is Velladi is the only one of the only two Indians to have ever won an Albert Medal for bravery during the colonial period. He saved the life of Mr. H.S. George, who was the DFO at that time, from a man-eating tiger by putting himself at basically in the jaws of the tiger to save him. And he was awarded that Albert's medal. The only other medal was given to a gentleman who then is now, I mean, who went off to Pakistan post partition. So he's technically the only Indian who got it. And his I wouldn't have known this story, but somebody posted, actually how it happened was, somebody posted a photo of a bracelet. His family, long after he's been gone, in a small village in Gadchiroli in Maharashtra, they still have that bracelet, and somebody had posted about it. Could somebody find the story? And I was able to trace down, so on and so forth. Similarly, you come across these, and that is an old grave of a forest officer I came across in Saranda. Nobody knew about it. I managed to eventually, after 3 years of effort, track down the family. Managed to. This is in Jolasal, which is in Nandhor Sanctuary in Kumau, near Haldwani. There were interesting ghost stories around this pillar, and how that madam was actually a bhoot, but I eventually managed to track down that she was not a bhoot. She had survived and had gone on to write 3 books, in one of which she described the entire incident. Her name was, so unfortunately, as was the case back in those days, you were always a missus of somebody. Women didn't seem to have their own agency in the eyes of the men back then. So she's written as Mrs. E.A. Smithies, but her name was Olive Smithies. And if you Google her up, you'll find books by her. One of the books is called Tiger Lady, published in 1955. That describes the entire incident where she survived. It's a jaw-dropping narration, but I'll leave you to read it. And there is stuff like this. This was an old notice that I came across in a forest register in old Bungalow in Kumau, in northern Corbett. And I was very struck by this term, Canning Benevolent Fund, and the instruction signed by none other than F.W. Champion, to donate. One is the upkeep of libraries. The libraries are all gone from forest rest houses. So has the culture of reading, I guess. And the other is the Canning Benevolent Fund. I was more intrigued by, because it was something what we talk about today. That is giving ex gratia money to the nearest kin of people, forest, the field staff who lose their life in the line of duty. and this was being done in the 1920s. And this was very interesting because the system back then was, and I was able to find out through archive digging and so on and so forth, that the system was basically that every forest officer, irrespective of their rank, donated a certain sum of money to a corpus, and that corpus kept on expanding. Then the corpus money was invested in a bank saving or something, and it kept on, and every month people would give off some money from the salary. It was fixed. And when then somebody died or some mishap happened, somebody got injured, the money would be taken out from that pool by the department and given to them. And because it was all done within the department, there was no kind of red tape that we see today, because it was all very well done. This is another, I mean, one of my things that I do is going to old forest bungalows, and if I can find an old photo, comparing it with the present. So this is that same bungalow in 1925, just after it has been built up, and this was in 2022. So in 100 years, the only difference is that tree has grown a bit bigger, and then this kitchen annex has been added. That was it. Then there are stories like this. I mean, Champion, everybody knows, but this is interesting because this is the world's first ever image of a wild tiger. This was taken by F.W. Champion in 1925 or 23. I'm not sure. I'm forgetting the date. But so this kind of stuff. I mean, we now, tiger photography is everywhere. Camera traps are everywhere. But if someone to ask you who took the first photo of the tiger, uh, you have to do a bit of digging and you'll find Champion Saab. And these are stories of forgotten men, the kind of things that they did for conservation, who were far ahead of this time or their time. This is S.P. Shahi, who was chief wildlife warden in the 1960s and 70s in Bihar, undivided Bihar. He was talking in the era when the only conservation and the only animal thought worthy of conservation was tiger, and tiger, Project Tiger was still, this debates around whether tiger should be put in endangered list was happening. He was championing for wolves, saying that the wolves are going extinct, and he took perhaps the first photographs of wolves in the wild. This was taken in the early 1970s in a place called Mahuadar, and then because he was so far sighted, he created the first sanctuary dedicated for wolves, called the Mahuadar Wolf Sanctuary, in the area where these wolves were found. They were mostly farmlands, as in they were not farmlands, but there were lots of villages around, there were farms around, and that landscape was interspersed with either open forest or scrub and so on and so forth. And people used to graze a lot. So he was far-sighted enough to recognize that the typical forest department approach won't work, of being heavy-handed won't work. So he actually got the villagers to work with him and said, you do your grazing, you do this, your rights will not be curtailed. Just let me declare this area as a sanctuary, so that I can ensure that the landscape is at least kept inviolate from further. In those days, he was actually trying to protect them from plantation. In those days, all those landscapes, the idea was afforestation was the buzzword in the 60s and 70s. So he wanted to protect that. And it's been 50 years, Shahi Sahib has been long gone, but the wolves are still there in Mawadar, and they're still breathing. And then this railway stuff that I find quite funny, where there used to be amusing incidents of tigers and other wildlife turning up on railway stations, and the chaos that they cause. So this says an awkward visitor at an upcountry railway station in India. So and yeah, that is it. I think I've missed out on some things, but I mean, I hope I haven't bored you with this.
Thank you so much. It's amazing tour de force. Thank you so much. Questions?
Hi, thank you for the wonderful talk. I have one question. I noticed that throughout the slides, you often mentioned where you had collected information in some libraries or some other old bookstores. I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate on the process of every place you generally go, where you seek
sure.
information, and which has been some of your most surprising finds.
Oh yeah, sure. In fact, that is what I had written. I have to speak about it, but I forgot about it. So I'm glad you asked that question. So I think I've actually I was just, before the talk, I was just jotting down the list that I usually look. You go for the usual, your Shikar books. You go for your, but what happens is often people read the Shikar books and then stop at that. But that is just one aspect of historical research. You read shikar books, you read general travelogues. What happened was often people were traveling and just writing general travelogues, and then there would be some interesting natural history or wildlife related tidbit buried under it. So if you know the general landscape that you are researching on, not just read shikar books on that landscape or so on, also read travelogues on that landscape. Read the gazetteers of those districts that you are looking into. The colonial gazetteers, most of the Indian gazetteers, the 70s ke baad to they stopped writing them altogether. And the gazetteers also, they have various iterations. So the first gazetteer might have come in the early 1800s, then the second edition might have come in the 1870s, then in the 1920s. So reading each gazetteer, you can make a sense of what are the changes happening to that landscape, what are the changes in population, what are the changes in the faunal makeup, the floral makeup, the hydrology of that area. It's an encyclopedia of that district. So consult that. Consult old newspapers. I mean, a lot of, I'm guessing, especially if you're affiliated with an institution, you have institutional access to a lot of newspaper archives. Always consult old newspapers. Internet has made things so easy. You can actually put in a keyword, and back in the days, even in my early days, I had to go and flip the pages of the library without knowing what I was trying to look at. But look at newspapers, journals. BNHS is perhaps the most important journal if you're looking into natural history into natural history research. But there were many or other obscure journals that were equally important, and some predate BNHS by quite a while. There was something called the Oriental Sporting Magazine. There was something called the Bengal Sporting Magazine. There was something called the Asian, the India Sporting Review. These were all in the early 1800s. So if you want to read about lions, cheetahs, those are the sources you have to look at. Sometimes there is an often there's a debate ki why are there not enough cheetah or lion references in shikar books? It's because the golden period of shikar literature comes from 1860s, 70s onward. By that time, the cheetahs and lions were already done for. So if you are trying to find those animals in books that were written much later, you won't find them. So you have to look at the 1820s, 1810, and so on and so forth. And even in modern time, go for smaller obscure journals. Go for the newsletter of, I don't know, newsletter for bird watchers. If you're into ornithology, go for a journal of something called the Bengal Natural History Society. There was a Sindh Natural History Society if you are interested in that sort of fauna. There was Nilgiri Wildlife Association. They had a publication that used to bring out. So there are tons of Cheetal, the one that caracal photo that I showed you from Dehradun. That was in fact very interesting because that was almost like brought up by forest officers. So if you want to get the perspective of how the forest officers at the time were thinking between the 50s and the 70s, that is a very good source. So that would be one. Settlement reports. Every district used to be the land, when the British used to settle the land revenue of that district, they used to give detailed accounts of often about the flora, fauna, and so on and so forth of that region. So that you can do. And because settlement was revised every 20, 30 years, so then you get a good idea of how things are changing. Um, I am not sure if people are familiar. There's something called Forest Department writes working plans. So for every 20 years, and this is a silvicultural thing. So every 20 years, they'll write a forest management plan. That is a critical resource if you want to understand the floral history of your landscape. I think Jayashree Ratnam from NCBS has oh hi. So she has done excellent research on that on the savanna landscape and how a lot of the forest was misclassified as what was savanna was classified as misclassified as forest. And it's no surprise because the kind of things I find about species that are who have savannas as their would call savannas as their ideal habitat, and the kind of profusion of those species both in terms of number and distribution that I have, it correlates to what she says. Working plans will give you an idea of what the forest officers were doing to your particular forest. What tree were they removing, what tree were they planting, why were they doing that, which area were they affecting, what was happening in those areas, how were they changing the hydrology of the area, so on and so forth. And then you can, the working plan usually don't speak much about wildlife, but then you can read those working plans of the floral makeup and correlate it from other sources of what was happening with the wildlife of that area during that period. So, and also don't forget vernacular literature. Urdu, there's tons of literature in Urdu, Hindi, Bengali. I'm sure all the other Kannada, there will be Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, everything. I mean, all the language. Bengali has a lot of literature. So if you can read it, very good. If you can't, get some of your friends to maybe help out. So these are the broad sources I would.
Thank you. Other questions?
Uh,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have two questions. First of all, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
First, I wanted to ask about the impacts of what you talk about societal or cultural extension of species on conservation or contemporary human wildlife interactions. So we have like a theoretical idea that how that works and how that impacts conservation. But like based on your experience, can you maybe like point out a particular species or particular areas from Indian context?
Areas I can, species I can. I'm not sure. See, at least now in the current generation, and I'll be very honest that especially in the last 25, 30 years, with the proliferation of the mobiles across, that sense of remoteness and being cut off from the outside world, that thing is almost now on its way out, even in some of the most remote areas I've gone to, especially in Jharkhand. I mean, I am speaking from Jharkhand. Obviously, northeast maybe things will be different, but I'm from for the mainland India at least that I can speak of. And there, what has happened is there's been a remarkable shift in the cultural makeup of communities between the younger generation and the older generation. So boys who are maybe in the 20s, 25, they actually don't really care much anymore. That this is my, at least my personal observation or my personal experience. Maybe people might have other experiences. It's the older generation who feel that sense of loss or that sense of longing, whatever you would like to call it. I've seen it all over the place. I've seen it in Saranda, I've seen it in Odisha, Chhattisgarh, especially in that quote unquote red corridor landscape, Maoist landscape, as they call it. And it is also has multitude of Adivasi communities who have their own distinct faith systems and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, bushmeat hunting is very rampant in these areas. And over a period of time, bushmeat hunting has done the wildlife in. And that is a good also, but I like their honesty. As in, I remember this very nice interaction I had with old man in Saranda. Um, his name was Honhaga. So I asked him a bunch of questions. Keh rahe, ye janwar kahan gaya, wo janwar kahan gaya. Something as common as sambar is extinct, for example, from those forests. 1,000 square kilometer forest with no sambar, which was a sambar stronghold 50 years ago. So I would ask, and they were like, yaar, ye sab bhunjia bana ke kha gaya. Bhunjia is basically bhunjia is stir fry. So they're honest about it, and then they say, ki, yeah, it's sad, but I think while it's a loss, people, at least of this generation, will move on from it, and within 20, 30 years, except for the names of the places, nobody will remember them. So places like there are certain places which have, for example, in whole language, the Samba is called Saram. So there's a place called Saram D, the home of the Sambar. There's no Sambar here. Maybe 50 years after, people won't even know that there is some Sambar here. They'll be like, oh, God knows why this place was named so. So that is how it is mostly.
Yeah, thank you. And secondly, considering the importance of looking at history when you're studying human-animal interactions, do you think ecologists and historians should work together?
Oh, absolutely. If they didn't, what would I do? No, but they absolutely. I mean, jokes apart, I think perhaps the most path-breaking work in this field has been done by, I would say, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. He's the ideal example of somebody who has brought history and the kind of work that he has done and informed our knowledge and opinion as a historian and going into the environmental history. That is remarkable, and there are many others like him. But I'm thinking, obviously, we need many more people like him to work together and collaborate.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So I see that most of your work is based around, archival research and research from the colonial period and a lot of colonial writing, which I understand is very dense in information. But say when you do go and explore information that was generated from princely states or from pre-colonial writing, what are some of the challenges that you face other than just a general lack of information?
I think that is another interesting bit. I don't think there's a general lack of information in pre-colonial period. The problem is the language. almost all the archives are in Persian, and it is not your Persian as in the current Persian, which is say spoken in Iran. It's an Indo-Persian, an old form of Mughal Persian, which very few people can speak or understand. Even if you were to bring the Persian-speaking Iranis and make them read or try to make sense of it, they would fail. So that is what makes the thing that was raised, that collaboration between historians and ecologists and very important, because it is only trained historians who can help you unlock those sources, who have trained in Indo-Persian, have studied this, and then you can help them with them understanding their histories better of the wildlife or the natural world, and they can help you better understand the history of the species or the floral and faunal makeup that you are landscape you are looking at. So it's a win-win for both. So that is one, and the other is Princely Chase Smith. The problem is that when the mergers happened, the archives were sent all over the place. So one Princely Chase, उसकी archives went 500 kilometers away at some headquarters, and then maybe 30 years later, if you go and you will be like, oh no, 10 years ago it was sent to some other place, and by the time you end up tracking it, you find that it's basically lost.
This is the merger into the Indian Republic.
Indian Republic, yes, during between post-independence.
Thank you so much, everyone. And we have tea hosted by the MSU Wildlife Program outside, so please do join us. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Fantastic talk.
Thank you.